Good evening, everybody. It's very cozy in here, but that makes it more atmospheric. I'm probably breaking every health and safety rule in the castle by having so many of you in here. So just for information's sake, public information, there are now 3 exits, the one over there and the 2 windows. I think we should just ask those 3 people sitting on the window to drop out, just so that we see the impact of dropping from this height. But I think you'd survive it, even if you'd have to go to hospital. Usually when I introduce a lecturer in the Durham Castle Lecture Series, I have a piece of paper with their CV on it and a list of all their publications. But I can't really be so formal in my introduction to John Thompson, Professor Thompson, Professor of Sociology from Cambridge. When I first met John, it would be hard to remember now exactly who had the longest hair. But I think we both had hair, you know, down to here at least, certainly as long as your hair. And those were the days where, you know, very long hair was very chic and fashionable. Now, of course, my hair slowly moves from here to here in my attempt to remember what it was like to have hair. It is an incredible pleasure for me to welcome John Thompson here. I've known John for a very long time. We both were in Cambridge together. John was doing a PhD, and I just finished one at MIT in the United States and came over. We both worked with Anthony Giddens, who we've been very close to ever since. And as it was called then, the Troika, we sat often together talking in the evenings. Cambridge is not short of good pubs. And one particularly fateful set of evenings on a very hot summer, we can remember that, took place in the Patman Act, and where we moaned to each other as to why were we spending so much time advising other publishers when we actually could be doing it ourselves. And we came up with this sort of drunken formula, which was PP equals C minus R, where PP stood for the name that we'd chosen, that John had come up with, called Polity Press, equals C minus R, where C is control and R is responsibility. So by the end of the summer, we'd convinced ourselves that we could have all the joys of controlling a publishing company without any of the responsibilities. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but what did work out is that summer was the beginning of not just a long friendship that John and I have had, and not just as academic colleagues who worked together on a number of things, but the beginning of a publishing company that we created then. There were 3 of us involved right from the beginning. The 2 survivors are still here. But in truth, and John is not only an outstanding academic and professor of sociology at Cambridge, as I've said, but he's one of the finest publishers in the world. And all the innovations that Polity has launched in the last decade or so are entirely from John's initiative. So John is a remarkable person for many reasons. One, he's just a great friend. Secondly, he's a great sociologist. But thirdly, he's a great publisher. And it's very unusual to combine all those things. What makes this possible is one of John's area of research is the book. So he happens to be a professor of sociology who specializes in the book, who's also a publisher. Organized that very well. And there are 2 books of his that I'd like to draw to your attention. He is the author of many books, but you can see that by Googling John Thompson. You don't need me to tell you them all. But 2 apropos this evening are, one is Books in a Digital Age, published some years ago now, which is a study of the academic book business. And more recently, the wonderfully titled Emergence of Culture, which is about the trade publishing business. There is simply nobody, in my view, who knows more about the book and the nature of publishing, and who does it so brilliantly in both respects as John. And I'd like you to give him a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that very generous welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful room, beautiful castle. A real honor to be here this evening. And I should say straight away that I blame David for this title. Yeah, it's not my title.
You should blame it.
It's his title, and I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because I'm not actually going to talk that much about the future of the book, and it was simply because no one really knows what the future holds in store, and especially this is true of the book and the publishing industry. I've been studying the book publishing industry for over a decade, and I've heard countless people speak with a great air of authority about the future of the book. It was always very interesting and very enjoyable to listen to, but there's just one little problem. They were always wrong, every time. So I try to avoid this kind of idle speculation about the future. I'm a sociologist above all, and my job really is to try to figure out how we got to where we are and how the world is organized today. But as to where we're going from here, what the future holds in store, well, that's really anyone's guess. So what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is this. What has happened to the world of book publishing over the last few decades, and where is the industry today? And then I will, towards the end, venture a few thoughts about what we can say about the future of the book and the publishing industry on the basis of what we can learn about its present and its recent past. Before I begin, let me just clarify the scope of what I'm going to talk about. The publishing industry is a very big industry, extremely varied. There are many different sectors of it and so on. So I'm not going to try to deal with all of that. As David said, I have spent a lot of time studying the world of academic publishing, but I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm going to focus this evening on just one sector of the publishing industry, the world of mainstream trade publishing, as it's called. That's the world of publishing that produces books of fiction and non-fiction for a wide general audience, the kind of books you would find if you walked into a store like Waterstones and W.H. Smith's and so on and so forth. It's that world that I'm going to be talking about, the world of including bestsellers like The Da Vinci Code or 50 Shades of Grey or whatever it might be. So I'm not going to be talking about the many other sectors like academic publishing and so on, but of course if you have questions about that, we can talk about that later. I'm also going to be talking only about Anglo-American trade publishing. So I'm not going to talk about French publishing or German publishing or Spanish publishing or any of the other different language regimes of publishing where the characteristics are often very different. Now, as I see it, the world of trade publishing is at a critical juncture today. Perhaps this is the most dramatic moment in the long history of the book since Gutenberg for 500 years. It is a very, very dramatic moment in the industry. It's a great time to be studying this industry because it is in turmoil. This critical juncture is the result of two processes or developments that, taken together, have shaped the field of trade publishing over the last 40 to 50 years. One of these processes is a set of profound social and economic transformations that have been underway since the 1960s and have created the world of trade publishing as we know it today. The other process is technological. It's the digital revolution, and it dates back to the 1980s in terms of its impact in the world of publishing. Taken together, these two developments have produced the world of trade publishing as we know it today, and together they will be decisive in shaping how this world develops in the coming years. So let me say something briefly about each of them. Let's start with the social and economic changes that have transformed the publishing industry. Now, when you set out to study the world of publishing, at first it looks like a mess. It's just a chaotic mess. The metaphor I always like to use is it's like a puzzle of pieces thrown on the floor, a picture puzzle, and all the pieces are all over the floor and it's just total chaos. And as a sociologist, when you start to study this industry, it looks like that. It's just a mess. It's really chaotic. And you begin to wonder, as you study it, whether you can make any sense of it at all. But what I argue as a sociologist is that if you dig beneath the surface of this disordered mess, you will find a certain order, a certain structure. And that order or structure is what I call the logic of the field. So the argument that I make, and that I'm going to summarize for you very briefly this evening, is that if you dig beneath the surface of this world of trade publishing, you can find a certain logic. And once you understand that logic, it enables you to understand how this world works, how people in this world do what they do, and why they do what they do. And so I spent 5 years trying to put those little pieces all into some sort of order to figure out what those pieces were a picture of. And what I will now very briefly summarize is my account of this logic of the field, and then we will look at how the digital revolution is transforming this logic in a few minutes' time. But first of all, let's reconstruct this logic of the field. Basically, there have been 3 key developments that have shaped the evolution of Anglo-American trade publishing over the last 40 to 50 years. And it looks like this. The first key development is the growth of the retail chains. If you were to go back to the 1940s or 50s, you'd find that books were sold in a whole variety of small independent bookstores and in a variety of non-specialist retail outlets like, for example, stationery shops, or in the US, department stores like Macy's and so on. But starting in the 1960s, you see the emergence of book retail chains. First of all, in the United States, it was the mall retail stores, the book chains that began in the malls. And then from the 1970s and 80s on, you see the rise of the so-called book superstore chains. In this country, of course, we know it as Waterstones. And in the US, there were 2 main book superstore chains, Barnes & Noble and Borders. The rise of these retail chains had 3 dramatic consequences in the publishing business. First of all, they devastated the independent booksellers. The independent booksellers simply could not compete with the big superstores like Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, and Borders. So hundreds of small independent bookstores were forced into bankruptcy. It's a sad but familiar story. Second, it led to a dramatic shift in the way that books were stocked and sold. Now, the principles that were used in other retail sectors like clothing and shoes could be applied to books. So, for example, in the front of the bookstores, you see tables piled high with books, you see dump bins and so on and so forth, all these there to stimulate impulse purchasing and multiple purchases. Moreover, computerized technologies could be used in order to monitor the rate of sale of books so that fast-selling books could be reordered quickly and slow-selling books could be returned to the publisher. Many of you may not know this, but book selling is one of the only retail sectors where unsold stock can be returned to the publishers for full credit. Third, and perhaps most dramatically, it led to what I call the hardback revolution. Now, you've all heard of the paperback revolution, where Alan Lane created Penguin Press back in the 1930s, selling cheap paperbacks on train stations and so on and so forth. But what you probably don't know is that the development of the retail chains brought about the hardback revolution. If you were to go back to the 1970s, hardbacks sold in large quantities, but not huge quantities. If you sold 500,000 copies of a hardback, that would have been something really, really exceptional. But by the early 2000s, thanks to the growth of the retail chains, it was now possible to sell hardbacks in the millions. So if you take a book like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, published in 2003, it sold more than 18 million hardback copies in the United States alone. That would have been inconceivable in the 1970s and before, thanks now to the growth of the retail chains that were able to push these hardbacks into markets across the country in large quantities. And this turned the financial models of the industry on their head. In the 1950s and 60s, the paperback was the foundation of trade publishing. In the 1980s and 90s, the hardback became the cornerstone of trade publishing. Now, in the last decade or so, this retail landscape has changed still further. The big superstore, bookstore chains like Barnes & Noble, Borders and Waterstones have run increasingly into difficulties. And as we know, Borders collapsed in 2011. And on the other hand, you've seen the emergence of new players like Amazon, which have become very powerful, and of course the non-specialist retailers like the supermarkets in this country, Tesco's, have become very, very powerful players in the retail sector. I'll come back to this later on. That's the first key development. The second, the rise of the literary agents. This is an extraordinary story that no one has told properly. It's just an untold story. It's something quite specific to the Anglo-American world of trade publishing. You do have agents in France, Germany, Italy, and elsewhere, but they're nowhere near as numerous and nowhere near as powerful as they are in the Anglo-American world. The story goes back to the late 19th century. A Scotsman, A.P. Watt, is usually regarded as the first professional literary agent, and he began representing authors in London in the late 1870s. And for 2 decades, Watt had the field more or less to himself, but then others realized it was a good business there and they began to enter the field, so he had some competition. The role of the agent remained pretty much unchanged for a century or so, but in the 1970s, it began to change. What we see from the 1970s and 1980s is the rise of what I call the super agent. These were people who came into the field from outside the field. Many of the agents that had been there in the early part of the 20th century were former publishers or editors that got fed up working for the publishing house, so they became independent agents. But the super agents came into the field from outside the field. They were not trained in the practices of publishing. Many of them were lawyers. Or they became literary agents by going straight from college or some other business into the literary field. So they didn't have the same tastes and the same judgments of editors and publishers. And they didn't come in with the same aims. They didn't see themselves any longer as intermediaries, operating in the space between authors and publishers and trying to satisfy both and to do a deal. They saw themselves rather as proponents or advocates of their clients', i.e. the author's, interests. So the legal kind of aspect of the literary agent became more and more pronounced. So good examples of this would be Morton Janklow or Andrew Wiley, 2 well-known American New York-based agents. Morton Janklow had been a lawyer, became a literary agent only because an old college friend of his phoned him up one day and said, "Oh, I've written a book about Nixon. Would you represent it with various publishers?" He said, "I don't know anything about publishing." He said, "Well, go ahead, do it anyway." So he went and did it, and he basically got into publishing from having been a lawyer. And Andrew Wiley went straight into agenting from college. Now, Andrew Wiley is a kind of infamous figure in the world of trade publishing. He's commonly called the Jackal because of his practice of poaching authors from other agents, a practice that is regarded as despicable by most other agents. But Andrew Wiley couldn't care less. He's not out to make friends with anyone. He doesn't care. He thinks that the traditional agent was a bit of a lackey who was trying not to rock the boat. Whereas in his view, the agent is simply there to represent the author and not to try to make everyone feel comfortable in this relationship. So Andrew Wiley is a very powerful player in this field, and he's someone who is both feared, loathed, and admired in roughly equal measures by other agents and publishers, and no one doubts that he's had a profound impact on the way the literary field works. The third key development is the emergence of the publishing corporations. Now, this is again a very important part of the story. It really begins in the 1960s when you see many of the formerly independent publishing houses getting bought up by larger companies and larger corporations. And now, today, there are only 4 or 5 large publishing corporations in the field of trade publishing in the United States and in the UK, and basically they are the same organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. And between them, they control roughly half the sales of trade books in the retail sector. So they are very, very powerful players. This process is complicated. There are many different reasons that explain how this has happened, and I won't go into them in detail, but we can come back to them later if you like. And the practice continues today. Only last autumn, Penguin and Random House announced that they were going to merge to form the largest trade publisher in the world. So this process of consolidation continues even today. So those are the three key developments that have shaped the logic of the field. So what were their consequences? Well, here were the consequences. First, they led to what I call the polarization of the field of trade publishing. Now, this is really extraordinary when you look at this world, because on the one hand, you have a very small number of large, powerful corporations. Only 4 or 5 large publishing corporations, themselves owned by multimedia conglomerates like Bertelsmann. And on the other hand, you've got a plethora of small indie presses. They're all over the place. There are hundreds of them. But you have very little in between. Very, very little. Think of Britain. Who are the medium-sized publishing houses? Well, there's Bloomsbury, largely a creation of Harry Potter. And there's Faber, whose position is protected by its legal status. Can't be bought. That's about it. There are only 2 medium-sized players. In this new world, the hardest place to be is medium-sized. Why? Why is it so hard to be medium-sized? Well, for 2 reasons. First, you can't achieve the economies of scale of the large corporate houses. The large corporate players, by buying up other companies, can consolidate back office systems, consolidate sales forces and so on. They get economies of scale. Moreover, those large houses are owned by big corporations that have very deep pockets. And so in the competition for new content, those publishing houses, those imprints of Random House or whoever it might be, can dig their hands, can dip their hands into the deep pockets of large corporate owners like Bertelsmann and pull out lots of money to pay very big advances to acquire new content. The medium-sized houses can't do it. They haven't got the resources to compete in this intense competition for new content. And so if they have a really successful author, they can't hold on to them. A great example of this is Charles Frazier. You may remember he is the author of a book called Cold Mountain. That was published by what was then a very small New York independent publisher called Atlantic Monthly. And Cold Mountain was Charles Frazier's first novel. It turned out to be a huge international success. And that one novel turned this small New York independent publisher into a medium-sized publisher. That one novel did. And of course, when Charles Frazier said, well, I think I'm going to write my second novel now, of course, the publisher at Atlantic Monthly was delighted, thrilled, great, we're going to have a new book. Wait a minute. Charles Frazier's agent decided that it was time to test the market. And so took this proposal for the second novel, which was going to be called 13 Moons, out to the market and shopped around to get other offers. And of course, there was no way that Atlantic Monthly could hold on to their one best-selling author. And Random House paid $8 million for the second novel, 13 Moons. No way that Atlantic Monthly could have held on to that for that amount of money. Now, as it turns out, this was something of a blessing in disguise for Atlantic Monthly, because 13 Moons disappeared without a trace and Random House lost a shed-load of money. On the other hand, the medium-sized publishers do not benefit from what we could call the economy of favors that tends to operate within the world of the small indie presses. I worked with a lot of these small indie presses in Brooklyn and elsewhere. And you see that they tend to exist within a parallel universe, a kind of world unto itself. that exists alongside the large corporate publishers. And it's permeated by a culture of collaboration and mutual help. So, for example, freelance designers who do covers and so on will tend to work for one rate when they work for the big corporate publishers like Random House, and a completely different rate when they work for the small indie presses. If they're doing a cover for Random House, they charge $5,000. But if they're doing a cover for their friend at, say, Soft Skull, a small indie press, well, okay, we'll do it for $500. Maybe a tenth of what they would charge for the large corporate publisher. That's the economy of favors. And the small indie presses live within this economy of favors. But the medium-sized houses are too big to participate in the economy of favors. So they lose out at both ends, and they tend almost invariably to get bought up at some point. The second big consequence, the preoccupation with big books. This is a great topic. Big books is a term that everyone in trade publishing uses all the time. You hear it as you interview these people all the time. They talk about big books this, big books that. They always talk about big books. Why? Why are they so obsessed with big books? Well, to understand this, we have to understand a fundamental tension at the heart of every large publishing corporation. And the tension is this. On the one hand, every large publishing corporation has to grow. Whether it's Random House or Penguin or Simon & Schuster or Hachette, they have to grow year on year, 8 to 10% every year. Their corporate bosses will expect it of them. On the other hand, the market for books in the Anglo-American world is largely static. It's not growing. Or if it grows only by the rate of inflation. So every manager in a large corporate publishing house has a fundamental problem. How do I grow in a static market? I call that the growth conundrum. It's quite simple, but they all face it. So how do they solve it? Well, you might think, easy. You don't need an MBA to solve that. Just publish more books. Surely, easy. Wow, they tried it. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. Why not? Because think how they got big. They got big by buying up lots of other companies. So those poor sales forces, which they've consolidated after buying up the houses, are now completely overloaded with new books. They can't take any more. They just can't. Don't give us any more books. We can't take any more. Too many already. So that doesn't work. So every large corporate house does exactly the opposite. Publish fewer books, but make sure they are big books. In other words, cut out the so-called mid-list. Those books that don't sell so well, and focus your attention more on big books. The aim, in short, is to maximize your sales on a smaller number of books. That's the golden rule that operates within every large publishing house. So, what are big books exactly? Difficult question. Most people in the business can recognize a big book when they see one, but they can't define it for you. They couldn't give you a definition of a big book. So what is it? Well, you might think, obvious. Big book is a bestseller. Wrong. And you have to see that it's wrong in order to understand how this business works. A big book cannot be a bestseller because it's big before it's even been published. 13 Moons was a big book. Random House paid $8 million for it. That's big. But it flopped. So what is a big book? A big book is not a bestseller, but a hoped-for bestseller. And that's an altogether different thing. The big book exists in the space of the possible, nourished by hope and expectation. It exists well before anyone knows whether it will actually become a bestseller. Because apart from new books, by brand name authors like James Patterson or Stephen King, those brand name authored books follow different rules. Apart from them, no one really knows which books will become bestsellers. They just don't know. These books have a no one knows quality. No one knows. And therefore, there is a large space in the world of publishing for what we can call buzz. Now, buzz, if you'll excuse me, is a technical term, and we can give it a precise definition. Buzz is talk about books which could be big. It's similar to hype, but not quite the same thing. Hype is the talking up of books by people who have an interest in talking them up. So agents hype. They hype books. Buzz happens when the recipients of hype respond with affirmative talk backed up by money. That's buzz. So what you have at the heart of trade publishing is what I call the web of collective belief. For many of the new books that are being offered by agents and being bought by editors and publishers, no one knows how well they will do. So a great deal of time and effort is spent in trying to persuade others that the book being offered is indeed a big book. That's what all those famous publishers' lunches are all about. Trying to persuade others that this is a big book. And a great deal of weight is placed on what other people, especially trusted people, like trusted agents with a good track record, think and say about the book and about how big it is. In the absence of anything solid, nothing is more persuasive than the expressed enthusiasm of trusted others. So the more the publisher ends up paying for a book, the bigger the book tends to be. This isn't exactly an iron law, but it's about as close to an iron law as you're going to get in this world. Publishers tend to give more priority and attention to the big books for which they've paid a lot of money, simply because there's a lot more at stake. So ironically, that creates a perverse incentive in the field to pay more for books rather than less. The more you pay, the bigger it is. There's just one hitch. The big book isn't the bestseller. It's just a hoped-for bestseller. It's a guess. It's a gamble. It's a roll of the dice. And some will pay off, and others won't. Can we quantify that? What proportion of these guesses pan out and what don't? Well, on the new hardbacks that the big publishing houses publish, probably around half of them lose money, fail. The other half make some money, but only 30% or so exceed expectations, and only the top 10%, 1 in 10, are really profitable for the houses. This brings me to the third characteristic, what we could call extreme publishing. All the large corporate houses work in the same way. Around this time of year, in terms of budgeting, they start to look at all the new books that are coming through the system, and they're trying to create the budget for next year now, for 2014. So they try to do it like this. All the new books that are coming through, look at all those books, try to estimate the likely sales of each of these books, and then work out a sales forecast for 2014 on the basis of all the material going through the pipe, all the books that are going through the system. And therefore, they work out their sales projections for 2014. And then probably in the middle of the summer, in June, July, they pass this sales forecast up to their corporate bosses. So, for example, Random House, the head of Random House will pass it up to Bertelsmann, who owns Random House. And the corporate chiefs at Bertelsmann will look at the sales forecast. Okay, let's say it's, just for the sake of a figure, let's say it's $800 million for 2014. And they'll pass it up to the corporate bosses. And the corporate bosses will look at it and say, oh, that's very nice, looks very good. There's just one problem. You said you're doing 800 million this year. Next year, we want 800 million plus 10%. And that extra 10%, that extra 80 million, is what in the business is known as the gap. The gap. And the task from about September on, when the publishing chiefs at Random House or Simon & Schuster, whichever house, get the gap figure, their task then is to figure out in about 6 months how to close the gap. And so they parcel out the pain to the heads of their divisions within the publishing house. Each one gets a share of the gap that they have to plug for 2014. And for 6 months, they feverishly search for new books that they can publish very quickly, crash it into the system and get it out very quickly. And that is what in the business is known as extreme publishing. Extreme publishing because you have to break all the rules. You have to find the books very fast, put them together very quickly, and publish them in a way that cuts through all the systems, gets the books out quickly, and so on and so forth. So, a good example of a book published through extreme publishing would be something like Paris Hilton's Confessions of an Heiress. Good example. Here's a book, lots of pictures, not much text in it, doesn't take very long to write, there are not many words in there. Everyone knows who it is, Paris Hilton, high recognition factor, easy to sell because all the booksellers and all the book buyers will know who this is. That was a book published by Simon & Schuster under their system of extreme publishing, intended to close a gap in their publishing systems, that gap between their estimates and what the corporate bosses expected of them. Of course, this kind of extreme publishing, which is throughout the industry, all the corporate houses work in exactly the same way, has its downsides. It can lead to some pretty bad publishing. For example, Paris Hilton. But also it puts a huge amount of pressure on publishers and editors who find themselves devoting an intense amount of time and energy to the closing of a gap. And especially on middle management, whose responsibility it is to close that gap. And the closer they get to the March deadline, because they basically have only 6 months from September to March, you can't really take on a book after March and still expect to publish it before the end of the year. So they have only 6 months. And the closer they get to the March deadline, the more desperate they become. And therefore, the more likely it is they find themselves paying a lot more for books than they really should pay, and therefore end up losing more than they should. Fourth characteristic, shrinking windows. That is, with the growing importance of the retail chains, this front of store space in Waterstones and Barnes & Noble and W.H. Smith's and all of these retail outlets becomes an extremely important battleground for the eyes and attention of consumers. So, of course, for a publisher, the question is, how do you get your books in that space? How do you get your books when you walk into Waterstones? Just next time you do, just stop at the door and look at what hits you visually. All of that space. That's the space, that's the battleground for publishers. So how do you get your books then? How do you get right at the front? How do you get there? Well, of course, you pay for it. And it's expensive space. Basically, it costs you about, in the US, about $1 a book to get those books on that front of store table. And about $10,000 to get a book on the front of store tables across all the outlets of a major chain like Barnes & Noble for 2 weeks, which is typically the minimum period. So that kind of visibility is very expensive. And of course that means that a publisher can't afford to keep a book there for very long if it's not selling. New books have less time than ever before to take off, to make a mark, to make an impact. So how long do they have? Well, basically, they have about 6 weeks, the so-called 6-week rule. Publishers monitor sales very closely for all those books on those front of store tables. Literally, they get daily feeds from the retailers. Every day they get a feed at the end of the day to say how many copies they sold. And they monitor it very closely. And the big corporate publishers are extremely good at pouring fuel on flames. So when a book begins to take off, they just pour more behind it. Get behind it, push it harder and harder. It's exactly how the Da Vinci Code took off. As soon as they had no idea, Random House had no idea it was going to be a bestseller in the way that it was. But when it began to take off, they really got behind it and they poured the resource behind it and it began to explode. But of course, the other side of the coin is that if a book doesn't show signs of taking off during that crucial 6-week period, then they're cut off pretty quickly, even in some cases when the author is in the middle of a tour and suddenly the resources are cut off. It's not uncommon. And finally, high returns. The growing role of these big retail chains, combined with the shrinking windows of opportunity, produce historically high levels of returns. So for most of the large trade publishers, return rates are about 30% on average. That means for every 100 books you send out, 30 come back to the warehouse as returns. Gone today, here tomorrow, as the famous expression goes. But this average figure of 30% conceals a great deal of variation. Basically, for adult hardcovers, it can range between 30 and 60, 70, even 80% returns. Send out 100 copies, 60 come back as returns. Now, not all of those returns are pulped, but a lot of them are. So this is a supply chain with a great deal of wastage built into it. So this little diagram, as it were, is the solution to the picture puzzle. That's it. If I've got it right, this logic of the field summarizes the underlying dynamic of Anglo-American trade publishing for the last 30 years. What I mean by this is that these are the key processes that create the field within which all the players in this field do what they do. Of course, not every player in the field is affected by these processes in exactly the same way. The large corporate houses like Random House and Penguin, Simon & Schuster, Hachette, are more affected by this logic than the small indie presses. But even the small indie presses cannot escape the influence of the logic of the field. They experience it too. For example, when they lose their only best-selling author to a large corporate house. This logic applies to Britain just as it applies to the US. But the way it plays itself out in the UK is slightly different from the way it plays itself out in the US. Why? Because there are different regulatory structures in the US and the UK. In the US, there's a very important piece of federal antitrust legislation called the Patman Act, dating back from the 1930s, from the Depression time. And what this piece of legislation says is that you, as a supplier, cannot discriminate against retailers who occupy a roughly similar market position. So publishers have to offer the same discounts to a small independent bookseller as they offer to a large retail chain like Barnes & Noble. They can't give Barnes & Noble a higher discount than they give to a small independent bookseller. They have to give them the same discounts. Otherwise, they will be sued under the Patman Act. And indeed they were in the 1990s under exactly this legislation. So this creates to some extent a level playing field in the book market in the US. In Britain, by contrast, the situation is very different. Here, there used to be something called the Net Book Agreement. Some of you might remember that term. It really was a kind of gentleman's agreement between publishers and retailers that dated back to the late 19th century. It said basically that retailers agreed to publish, to sell books at the prices that the publishers had set for that book in return for a comfortable margin. It was just a gentleman's agreement. We're all going to play by the same rules. And that lasted right up until the middle of the 1990s, when it collapsed. And it collapsed because then some of the big players decided they didn't want to play by the rules anymore, and then it was declared to be anti-competitive, and so it collapsed in the middle of the 1990s. And from that point on, retailers could sell books at any price they wanted. There was no constraint on the prices that they set. But unlike the US, in the UK there is no equivalent of the Patman Act. And that means that the biggest and most powerful retailers could then lean very heavily on the publishers to give them higher discounts for their books. So the biggest and most powerful retailers, like Tesco's, who now became interested in bookselling because they could discount the books, and they weren't interested before. Before the middle of the 1990s, the supermarkets weren't selling books. But from the middle of the 1990s on, when the Net Book Agreement collapsed, they became very interested because now they could discount and they could compete with other retailers on prices. They put huge pressure on publishers to give them higher and higher discounts. So you see a profound shift from the middle of the 1990s to the early 2000s in the UK in terms of the discounts that publishers give to retailers. Back in the early 1990s and before, the average discount was about 45% for trade books. That means if the publisher was selling the book to the retailer at a discount of 45% off the list price, and then the retailer kept that gap, that extra bit for themselves. But now that discount is often 60% or more, even higher, sometimes 65%. And the biggest discount goes to the largest and most powerful retailers, like Tesco's. Because Tesco say, we would love to buy thousands of copies of your book, but only if you give us a high discount of 65%. And that's why when you go into Tesco's or Sainsbury's, the books are so cheap. Why are they so cheap? Ask yourself, why are they so cheap? This is why they're so cheap. Leading to an almost absurd situation with the final volume of Harry Potter, where many independent booksellers were buying their stock from the supermarkets rather than from the publishers because they got it cheaper from the supermarkets who were using it as a loss leader and who had used their muscle to get higher discounts. That means that while publishers in Britain and the US face intense downward pressure on their margins, they do for structurally different reasons. Basically, publishers are situated in the middle, between agents on the one hand who control access to new content and authors, and retailers on the other who control access to customers. In the US, the downward pressure on margins stems from the escalating advances that reflects the power of the most powerful agents. Whereas in the UK, the downward pressure on margins stems from the retailers, expressing the high discounts that the retailers get and reflecting the power of the most powerful retailers like Tesco's. So that basically is the social and economic processes that have shaped the world of publishing as we know it today. Let me now turn briefly to the technological transformations. And here I'm talking, of course, about the digital revolution, which began to have a serious impact on the publishing industry from roughly the mid-1980s on. Now, the real impact of the digital revolution in the publishing industry is often very poorly understood because people just focus on the question of the ebook And they failed to understand that this whole world of publishing was profoundly transformed from the mid-1980s on in a plethora of different ways. The whole production system was transformed. The whole supply chain was transformed by the digital revolution. Many, many other aspects of this transformation apart from the ebook. Nevertheless, there is no question that the delivery of the content to consumers as electronic content in the form of an ebook is an immensely important part of this transformation, of this digital revolution. Essentially, what the digital revolution does at this level is to separate form from content. That is, for 500 years, the book was an expression of form and content unified in a singular object, the physical book. And so we today think of the book as a physical object. But what the digital revolution did was it abstracted the content from that form, so that the content could be realized in a variety of other forms, including some rather ethereal forms like ebooks. Now, from the late 1990s and early 2000s on, publishers saw the enormous potential of this, because all of those inefficiencies, the supply chain, could easily be wiped out if content could be delivered electronically rather than as physical books. Just think, for example, of the question of returns, which is one of the most difficult problems in trade publishing. You send out 100 books, and 30, 40, 50 come back to your warehouse as returns. Think of how difficult it is to achieve decent margins when you're having to pulp half of your stock. So, if you were able to deliver content electronically, it would help to solve so many of these problems in the supply chain. So many publishers were quite eager to pursue this path, although they knew that there were also dangers in this path. But throughout the early 2000s, there was much talk of ebooks, but nothing much was happening, especially in trade publishing. It just wasn't happening. Publishers were investing a lot, they were putting a lot of content out, but the uptake wasn't there. However, it began to change around 2008. And you can see that very dramatically if you look at this graph. This shows you US trade wholesale ebook sales by quarter from 2002 through to 2012. And you see in the early 2000s, nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. They simply were not selling. But then, beginning in 2008, you see this precipitous incline. There is a very dramatic growth of ebook sales. Very dramatic indeed. So that you see this big surge happening from this point on. Another way of looking at this is in terms of the proportion of publishers' revenues accounted for by ebook sales. If you go back to 2006, publishers, the big trade houses, would tell you that only about 0.1% of their revenues were accounted for by ebooks. A negligible figure, insignificant. However, by 2010, it had risen to 8%. And by 2011, it was up to about 20% of their revenue was being accounted for by ebook sales. These are the main US trade publishers. That's a dramatic shift in a very short period of time. So how can we explain this dramatic change? What had changed? Well, one thing was obviously crucial here: the Kindle. In November 2007, Amazon launched the first Kindle ebook reader in the US and marketed it very aggressively. Of course, it wasn't the first ebook reader. There'd been you could fill a small museum with the ebook readers that had been developed in the late 90s and early 2000s. I mean, there were just dozens of them. But when Amazon brought on their ebook reader in 2007 and 2008, it changed the game. It totally changed the game. And that is partly what underlies this dramatic surge. So that was no doubt that Amazon's Amazon's Kindle played a crucial role here. We can talk about why that might be so a little bit later if you're interested. Of course, this is only the US. And the figures are not the same for the UK or elsewhere. Ebook sales are growing significantly in the UK, but they're still well behind the US. They were about 2% of the sales of UK trade publishers in 2010 and probably around 8% in 2011. So well below, at least a year behind, the figures in the US. And in other languages and other countries, they remain insignificant. France, Germany, Italy, insignificant up to this point in time. These figures are impressive, but they mask huge differences in terms of the different kinds of books that are selling as ebooks. Now, in the early mid-2000s, if you talk to people about this impending change, and I talked to lots of people because this research goes back to the late 1990s, so I was talking to people all through these years, and most of the people who were thinking hard about ebooks and this imminent transformation or the likely possibility of this change, all of them thought that when the change came, it would be driven above all by businessmen and business books. That's what everyone thought, more or less. Everyone really expected business books to be at the forefront of this transformation. You know, businessmen, they've got the devices, they're rather tech savvy, they sit around in airports a lot, you know, what are they doing there? Well, they can read their books. Everyone thought this is where it was going to happen. But as so often happens in this domain, the predictions were completely wrong. Completely wrong. And no one saw this coming. No one saw it coming. When it came, when the change began, it wasn't business books at all. It was genre fiction, romance, sci-fi, mystery, thriller. That's where it really began to grow. No one saw this coming. It caught everyone by surprise. So if you looked at some of the large US trade publishers in 2011, you'd find that in the area of fiction, ebooks by 2011 were accounting for about 40% of their sales. Wow, that's huge. And if you look at some areas of genre fiction like romance, you know, Mills and Boon style romance fiction, it was as high as 80%. This was a revolution that was being led by largely female readers, using Kindles, buying romance fiction on Kindles. For some romance writers, the proportion being sold as ebooks was even higher, as high as 80% of the books that were being sold were ebooks, giving rise to the real possibility that some of these books would not be published as physical books at all, but only as ebooks. Now, while the shifts were strongest in genre fiction and commercial fiction, there's also been a strong shift in literary fiction too. So you take a book like Jonathan Franzen's Freedom, which was published in autumn 2010, sold about 1 million copies in its first year, 750,000 were in print, hardcover, 250,000 were as ebooks, so 25% were ebooks. Then you look at a book like Jeffrey Eugenides' The Marriage Plot, published a year later. It's even more striking. Half of the front list sales in the first year were ebooks. Half, 50%. These are dramatic changes. But anything more, with nonfiction, the shift was much slower, and still is much slower. Nonfiction lags well behind fiction in terms of ebook sales. So with nonfiction books, the biggest shift has been in simple narrative nonfiction like biography, especially popular biography, memoir, misery memoir type thing. but also some narrative history, or some big ideas books, purely narrative. There you see sales accounting, ebook sales accounting for 20 to 25% of the total. But anything more complicated, like heavily illustrated cookbooks, art books, children's books, not much sales electronically for these up to this point in time. No discernible shift, at least not yet, for this kind of book. So how are these trends likely to evolve in the coming years? Well, the truth is, no one knows. No one knows. The most recent figures on ebooks, and I follow this quite closely, the most recent figures on ebook sales in the US suggest that we're seeing a certain decline in the rate of growth of ebook sales from one year to the next. And so if we quantify it, it looks something like this. If you go back to 2007, you see the growth rate was pretty dramatic, 1.5 times. Then you see 2009, the growth is 3 times. That's huge, dramatic growth in 2009. And then the rate of growth begins to slowly decline over time. It's still growing, but not at the same rate as that surge in 2009 and 2010. Now, I wouldn't read too much into these figures. We simply don't know how the pattern's going to evolve in the coming years, because by its very nature, this is an unpredictable trend, dependent on a host of incalculable factors, from as yet unknown technological innovations to the habits and tastes of readers. And there's no one that anyone can know for sure whether the trend will continue to grow upwards slowly, maybe the rate of growth slows, but nevertheless it continues to go upwards, or whether it will level off, or whether it might even decline at some point. No one knows. Regardless of what the exact figures turn out to be, there can be no doubt that we are witnessing major changes that will have profound consequences for the publishing industry and the future of the book. The traditional revenue models of trade publishing, which have always relied on market segmentation and the windowing of editions that are differentially priced. The hardback, followed by the trade paperback, followed by the mass market paperback, all sequentially structured in a windowing style, all at a different price point. All those models are now being radically called into question by the ebook surge. Because if an ebook is available at the same time as the trade hardcover, what impact is that going to have on the sale of the hardcover? But also, what impact will it have on the sale of subsequent paperback editions? If someone can buy it at a much lower price from the point at which it's first published, why would they wait around for the trade paperback or the mass market paperback to come out in 2 or 3 years' time? And what consequences will these changes have, if indeed they occur, for the revenue streams and profitability of the publishing houses themselves? No one knows the answers to any of these questions. But everyone in the industry is wondering anxiously about them. They are watching, experimenting, carefully scrutinizing the figures day by day, week by week, month by month, as if they were tea leaves, searching for clues about their future. So that's where we are today. We find ourselves at a particular conjuncture where the unfolding of the logic of the field is colliding with a technological revolution that is beginning to challenge and disrupt the rules of the game. The dramatic surge in ebooks is forcing every player in the field to reconsider their positions. Practices that have become settled conventions in the field are suddenly being opened up to scrutiny. Players who have interacted amicably for years, even decades, suddenly find themselves locking horns in new conflicts where the rules are no longer clear. And even new norms that seem slowly to be crystallizing into industry standards, like the 25% rule on ebook royalties, are but a temporary truce, reflecting the current balance of power in the field. The field of power remains, but the game is changing. No one knows how these changes, combined with the economic turbulence of recent years, will play themselves out in the field of publishing in the years to come. We're living through a revolution of sorts. And one of the few things you can say with any degree of certainty about a revolution is that when you're in the middle of one, you have no idea when and where it will end. Some short-term trends are easy enough to see, and by way of conclusion, let me briefly mention 8. First, Amazon will continue to grow as a retail channel, while bricks and mortar bookstores, including the chains, will find themselves squeezed further and further, leading to more bookstore closures, I'm afraid, and downsizing on the part of the retail chains. In many ways, the bankruptcy of Borders in 2011 marked the end of an era, in the sense that the age beginning in the 1960s that had been dominated by the big retail chains rolling out their superstores across America or across Britain is now definitively over. We're entering a new era where these retail chains that remain are much weaker than they were, and where Amazon has become the main retail force to be reckoned with. Second, publishers with weak balance sheets and companies that are highly leveraged will face growing financial difficulties. And the pressures on those medium-sized publishers that remain will intensify. Some of the large corporations will probably decide that the time has come to divest themselves of their trade publishing interests, which were always a very small part of their overall portfolios anyway, leading to further consolidation in the hands of a small number of large corporations that do remain committed to trade publishing. So the recently announced merger of Random House and Penguin is a good example of this, and we should not be surprised to see more mergers and acquisitions of this kind in the next few years. Third, the decline of the physical bookstore will make it harder for publishers to get their books noticed. So the struggle for visibility will both intensify and become displaced as publishers are forced to devote more and more of their marketing effort to the online environment, where they will hope to find new ways of bringing their books to the attention of readers. The problem of how readers discover new books will become an increasingly vexed issue. You won't discover them anymore by browsing around a bookstore. So this problem of how you get your books discovered becomes increasingly complicated and vexed for publishers themselves. Fourth, the shift from print to digital will continue. But the speed and extent of the shift will vary from one category to another, and income from ebooks and other forms of electronic content delivery will become an increasingly significant part of publishers' revenues. Though exactly how significant it becomes is, at this point in time, unknown. No one knows. Maybe 25%, maybe 30%, maybe 50%, maybe more. No one knows. My own personal view, though it's only a personal view, is that the future of publishing is more likely to be a mixed economy of print and digital than a one-way shift from print to digital. And the most successful publishers are going to be those who are able to restructure their organizations and their practices in a way that enables them to take full advantage of both. Fifth, publishers will face growing pressure in terms of price deflation. That is, a tremendously strong downward pressure on prices, especially for ebooks. In my view, this is one of the greatest challenges that the publishing industry faces today, the constant downward pressure on prices. It's a problem you see across all the creative industries. As content becomes cannon fodder for large and powerful retail and technology companies like Amazon or Apple that use content to drive the sales of their devices and services and to try to increase their market share, thereby devaluing intellectual property and sucking value out of the content creation process. This is why the struggle between the publishers and Amazon in 2010, a dramatic battle that broke out in January 2010 over the pricing of ebooks, was so important for the industry, and why the outcome of the recent suit between the US Department of Justice and the large publishing houses will have such significant consequences for the industry as a whole. Sixth, as more sales shift to digital and downward pressure on prices intensifies, the large publishing houses will face growing downward pressure on their top-line revenues, calling into question their continued ability to generate year-on-year growth, which they have always relied on, and refocusing their attention more and more on how to reduce costs and overheads in order to try to maintain their profitability in the context of static or declining sales. So more and more effort within every house will be focused on cutting costs in every way they can in order to try to preserve their bottom line in a context where their top line is falling. Seventh, at the same time, the infrastructure supporting the traditional book supply chain, warehouses, sales forces, etc., will come under increasing pressure, forcing publishers to look for new ways to try to keep the physical supply chain going, like, for example, offering distribution services to third parties, while at the same time trying to shift the organization to a new way of doing business. Eighth and finally, small publishing operations and other startups will proliferate on the margins of the field, and threats of disintermediation will abound as both traditional and new players avail themselves of new technologies and the opportunities opened up by them to try to eat the lunch of their erstwhile collaborators. Beyond these short-term trends, the picture is much less clear. Lots of people have their hunches, but in a world where there are so many variables and where unanticipated developments could occur at any time, my hunch is probably no better than anyone else's. Thanks very much.
Yes, publishers and librarians. Let's start with you, Dave. Let's start with librarians.
As a university librarian, acting where libraries fit into this, are we the disintermediation, or are we on the future?
Well, I think every player in the field is now looking again at what role it plays in the value chain, in the supply chain. Every player, and wondering whether they can be disintermediated by these developments. So publishers are wondering, what if authors say they don't need publishers anymore? Publishers become disintermediated. Then agents start to think, well, wait a minute, maybe the author doesn't need the agent anymore. Agents become disintermediated. Of course, booksellers, if content is delivered electronically, who needs the bookseller? They become disintermediated. Librarians have to ask themselves the same question. What role, what value are they adding? What role are they playing in these supply chains? Now, it's easy to ask the question about disintermediation. Everyone has to ask themselves that question. It doesn't mean that they will be disintermediated, because they may actually be playing certain important roles even in the new emerging electronic supply chains. So, for example, there can be a real role for publishers in the new world that is coming into being, that is part physical, part electronic. And they can continue to play a real role in that. Although there are self-publishing organizations that would want to say authors don't need those traditional publishing houses anymore. So everyone is asking themselves this question. Librarians are in fundamentally no different position in that respect. Their role is, you will, I'm sure, know much better than any of us, has changed profoundly in this context, so that you are less defined primarily in terms of being a physical curator of books and more being an informational hub, basically. And so if you redefine your roles as an informational hub, providing access to content in a structured way for users, then you do continue to have a function and have a role in these new emerging environments. So, but everyone has to ask themselves that question, basically.
Yeah, given the
We're switching now from librarian to publisher, so let's just declare interests.
Yeah, I'm very interested. You mentioned there for the first time self-publishing, and of course tying in with that, the new market of the author, and given the restrictions of the logic of the field as you discussed it, one of the options, it seems to me, for publishers as they move forward is to not play on that field. And instead to look to other markets, such as the author. And I wonder whether we're going to see that the growth, that's one of the areas of growth, as I was seeing it, is the self-publishing market. And there's two possibilities there as well, where when you're talking about that buzz as well, when you find that sweet spot of that buzz, that if you're able to prove that in the self-publishing market, because nobody actually knows, that you are then able to move the author from that model back into the logic of the field.
Sure.
And indeed that's why we're starting to see things like you talked there about Penguin and Random merging. But of course prior to that, the actual Penguin buying out Author Solutions as the world's largest self-publishing company. Do you think we're going to see more of the traditional publishers move into that self-publishing arena?
Absolutely, no question about it, because publishers are aware that there is a big risk here for them, that their best-selling authors could say, we don't need you anymore. We can basically go directly to market without you. And so they know there is that risk. And so they, in a variety of different ways, are looking both to appropriate the self-publishing into their organizations, like the example you just gave, but also to rethink the way they relate to their authors, to try to create a service that they are offering to their authors. They will hold them and make them feel that it's worth staying with them and it's worth paying for what they offer. So you're absolutely right, that is exactly what's going to happen. But these worlds are going to interlock and intersect in very complicated ways. This is not going to be a straightforward matter. And the perfect example is 50 Shades of Grey. Yeah. Started as a self-publishing, and it is appropriated by the industry and became the big bestseller that has totally made Random House's year. Totally made it, actually. And so there you see these worlds overlapping and intersecting in complicated ways. And this is exactly how this space is going to shift. The lines are going to change over time. They become interlocking in various complicated ways. And so moving forward, you're absolutely right about that. I can't take the analysis a lot further than this at the moment, because I was telling you over dinner that actually this is the next piece of research that I'm doing. I've basically done these two projects, one on academic publishing and the other on the transformation of trade publishing, and the third is really focusing now on the digital future and looking at these new emerging players who are proliferating in the field, and basically, they are trying to eat the lunch of other publishers. And it's a very, very interesting, array of players working with many different models, some being self-publishing, others going back and trying to pick up the digital rights of books that were previously published as ordinary books, as printed books, and so on and so forth. So this is a very complex set of processes taking place in this field now, but the one you described is certainly one of them.
I've got a question. Has Amazon got anything to lose? Because from what the story you tell, it might look like Amazon can just sit there whilst publishers fight it out, and whatever happens, they'll still need global distribution. So they can still lock into this global distribution network, irrespective of who generates the content.
Yeah.
Or do you think this has implication for Amazon and these large retailers?
Well, I mean, Amazon are in a tremendously powerful position in this field now. There's absolutely no doubt about it, because they are the most, probably, if not the most, they are either the most or the second most important client for physical books for most publishing houses, and they have the lion's share of the ebook market. So they are the dominant player in the ebook market. So they are in a tremendously powerful position in this new field now. And of course, they have also got into self-publishing. And so they are actually, and they've not just self-publishing, but also more traditional publishing too. So they are actually trying to integrate vertically to be a publisher as well as a retailer. Right. And so they are in a very, very powerful position. Much, as I alluded to very briefly, much will depend a little bit on how this battle over pricing plays itself out. This is it sounds like a very sort of small detail of the story, but in fact it's an absolutely critical part of the story, because Amazon will try to be the dominant player, to maintain their position as dominant player. They need to increase their market share by heavy discounting. And they can only do that if they use a discount, if the publishers are selling to them on a discount model. And so this is a rather technical topic, but the conflict between the discount model or the wholesale model on the one hand and the agency model on the other is absolutely critical to the way this field plays itself out, and absolutely critical to the power of Amazon.
But if they're increasingly integrating vertically, then they have it's many motives to drive increased discount prices.
Sure.
Because the harder they push,
sure. Yeah.
the more they can push out some of their competitors.
Yes,
content.
But of course it remains very unclear at this stage the extent to which their publishing business will be successful. Because again, if you think it from the point of view of an author, yes, okay, there's some attraction to publishing with Amazon, but you basically you're locking yourself into one particular retailer then. Whereas if you are publishing elsewhere, you're going to have a multiplicity of different outlets, and so there are pros and cons for authors of going with Amazon. So it remains unclear how successful that business will be.
Let me ask you one more question, and we'll go back to the audience, because there are a lot of people here who might be thinking, "Oh, I'll have a career in publishing." As 10 years ago, one might have given stable advice.
Yeah.
This is how you do it, there's where to go, you get an internship here, internship there, your career ladder looks like this.
Yeah.
I guess the implication of what you're saying, John, is that's much more fraught.
Oh, I think it is. I mean, I think the way the industry is going to go is very unclear. It is very, very unclear. But I think that there's going to be a certain degree of downsizing in the industry. That seems pretty clear, because if you look back with the broad perspective of history, you can see that this period from 1960 to 2000 was this massive expansion of the industry. It just really grew. It was being driven by these processes that I was analyzing earlier on, the consolidation of the big houses and so on and so forth. And they were all managing to achieve, really consistent growth year on year, largely through massive mergers and acquisitions that enabled them to cut out lots of costs and to get economies of scale and to grow through mergers and acquisitions. But that game is over now. They bought everyone. There's nothing more to buy, actually. And so, I mean, there's still more merging that can and will occur, as the Random House penguin example shows. But that process is getting more and more difficult. And so I think, you are going to see, a certain degree of downsizing occurring. And that for new people in the industry, that it's a much less clear picture as to where it's going to go in the future. I don't think we should be overly negative about and pessimistic about this, though, because it's still a very dynamic industry and there's a lot going on. It's just rather more complicated now, and I think you have to be much more open-minded and see that developments are going to occur in all sorts of unusual ways in this field now. Much as you were saying, really, you can't say who the dominant players are going to be in a few years' time. The situation is much more turbulent now.
Okay. Yes, gentleman at the back. We've got lots of questions now, John.
Thank you, and thank you for very good information. The only position that you didn't mention, what is the position of the authors and writers? In your demonstration, you said, how was it in the last 30 years? And one last question, do you think this past 30 years and this time has been a better time for authors or the time before?
Okay. That's a great question.
Should we take a few questions now?
I'd love to answer that. I'd love to answer that question, though, because you're absolutely right. And so, I mean, there is a reason why I didn't talk about authors, and that's because I don't see authors as part of the field. Authors are on the margins of the field, and this is a really interesting question because, I intentionally did not interview authors until I was at the end of this research, because I wanted, first of all, to understand the structures and the logic of the field. And then in the last year, I interviewed, 24 authors, probably 20 or 30 authors, which was totally eye-opening for me. And one of the reasons it was eye-opening is because, for the most part, authors haven't got a clue. They know almost nothing about what I've just been saying tonight. They just don't understand this industry upon which they depend. They don't understand it at all, actually. It's true of everyone. It's not true of everyone. But so many of them, they just don't understand it. I mean, I interviewed some authors who had been publishing for 30 or 40 years, lived in New York, and they didn't understand even the most basic things about the industry, the most basic things. And so one question is, why do they understand so little about the industry? And the reason is because they outsource knowledge to their agents. They give it to the agent. They say, could you please make sense of this, and you find the publisher for me. I don't really understand it. I don't understand who the players are, et cetera, et cetera. So they basically outsource the task of understanding the business to the agent. The agent is their way into the industry, but they don't really go into the industry themselves. They're on the outside because their worlds are different worlds. And that became very clear to me as I interviewed authors. And this is a parallel research that I've been working on and that I'm still working on. I've not immersed myself in it as much as I have understanding the industry, but I have a separate project which is to work on the worlds of authors, the worlds of writers. And it's absolutely fascinating because they have their own worlds, but they're worlds of other writers. And they don't really intersect very much with the worlds of publishers. So their point into the field of publishing is through their agent. And the agent is the mode of access. So the first thing is that they are on the outskirts. So that's why I didn't talk about them, is that they're not really part of that world. Although they are the creators of the content. They are the source of the content. But they are not players in the game. Now, so your second question, that's not true of all of them. Some of them are very clued up, and they really do understand it, and actually they are players in the game. James Patterson being an example. He's like an institution in himself in the field. But most of them just don't really want to get involved in that, actually. They don't want to get involved. But the second thing that is really striking for me is that authors experience the logic of the field in their own way. They suffer they suffer the consequences of the logic of the field. And so I heard the story over and over again in my interviews with authors of how a typical author's career is that, they start off their career, their first book, their second book, agents are really interested, they're very excited, publishers are very excited, they're the new big thing. Money is poured at them, big advances beyond their wildest dreams. And they just soldier on for a few years, and then suddenly things start to go quiet, and then all of a sudden they're in their 50s, and it all collapses around them like a house of cards. I heard that story over and over and over again. And by that time, usually in the interview, it was about an hour and a half into the interview, we're into a third glass of wine, tears were streaming down the face. You know, time and again, I heard that story. You know, and then you map that story onto the logic of the field, and it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. Because by that stage, the sales trajectories of the books had not gone like this. They'd gone like this. And they were carrying the track record of their sales around their necks like a noose. And at some point, it just choked. And that was it. It was over. It was completely over. They had no agent. They had no publisher. They had a new book they were working on. They didn't know what they were going to do with it. Time and time again. So that's the human cost of the logic of the field. Now, your last question. Is it a good time for authors? I mean, I think it's an exciting time for authors because it is turmoil now. Now all the rules of the game are up in question. And so it's quite interesting what's going on. I think it's a very exciting time. It's an interesting time. The continental plates are shifting in ways that are complex and no one fully understands yet. And so it's an interesting time to be an author. Although your ability to command a high advance is very much in question now.
As I was listening to your lecture, I suppose it made me curious to hear your thoughts on what type of role the regulatory landscape might play in this model and in this logic that you talk about, particularly in mind of the fact of what's been happening in the financial regulatory sector, and especially when you mention massive mergers and conglomerations, it makes me wonder what role the Competition Commission has in these types of things.
It's a great question. And
you know, it's a great question. Let me just pick on, and I think it's really important. It's really important. I think. You know, I think there was one. I'll just tell you. I'll answer a little bit by an anecdote. There was one moment in one of these interviews back, I don't know, 2008 or something like that, probably maybe 2000, something like that, maybe 2007. I don't remember now. Where I was interviewing the sales director of a very large American publishing trade house. And we were having a breakfast interview because she was a very busy person. And so we started at 7 or something. So we were at 8 o'clock, the interview was coming to an end, and she just said, "You have one last question." So I asked her a question. I said, "Okay, well, you've spent a bit of time in the UK, and we've been talking about the US meeting. You've spent a bit of time in the UK. So just in conclusion, could you just give me your view as an American sales director of the UK?" And she looked at me with a little smile on her face. And she said, "The Wild West. It's the Wild West." And that sort of really brought the point home, that what you have in the UK is a totally deregulated book market. Totally deregulated. The US is actually quite regulated because of the Patman Act. Because of the Patman Act. But in the UK, it is the Wild West. You know, the more powerful you are in the field, the more you discount. Tesco's is, you know, you could argue that the most powerful player in the UK book market today is Tesco's. Now, what is that telling us about the book market when a supermarket is the most powerful player? And you see, one of the things that I always find very interesting, look at the UK bestseller list in the Observer or one of the Sunday papers, you know, and compare it with the US bestseller list. It's like chalk and cheese, you know. The UK, you know, the UK bestseller list is basically cookbooks and misery memoirs. Basically, that's what it is. Okay, plus, you know, commercial fiction, you know, 50 Shades of Grey, that kind of thing. But basically, and then next time you're in the supermarket, go have a look. That's what it is. It's the supermarkets that determine the bestseller lists. Basically, they're the one who shift thousands of books, tens of thousands of books. They're the most powerful. It's a highly deregulated market. So this is a long answer to your question, but I mean, it shows you the importance of regulation here. And, it's devastating for the independent booksellers. Totally devastating. It's so hard for them to exist in this market. Because Tesco's it's the example of Harry Potter. I mean, it's cheaper to buy your stock from the supermarkets than to buy from the publishers. This can't be right. It's totally deregulated. So the most powerful retailers are the ones, who have all the market power here. And so I think that's not an ideal situation. It's not good for the industry, and it needs to be looked at. But a second thing that I think is really troubling, I would say, is the way the US Department of Justice got involved in the controversy over ebook pricing is really questionable. It's really questionable. They intervened. Now, the publishers really did, but they were a bit stupid, it has to be said. I mean, don't quote me on that. But they were a bit silly, really, to have dinners, to have dinners together at a crucial time. So they just left themselves open to the charge of conspiracy to fix prices. They really did. They shouldn't have done that. It was very foolish of them to do it. But nevertheless, the US Department of Justice is, they've really hammered the publishers. But they haven't really looked at Amazon's power in that marketplace. They haven't looked at it, actually. Amazon are sitting pretty. They're just, wow. I mean, they really are so happy the US Department of Justice has taken the publishers to the cleaners over this. But, because, Amazon are laughing all the way to the bank. Mm. And that's, again, a really complex issue, and I'm not sure that's been handled properly.
It's getting late, John, so let me just take one more question from the audience. Oh, let's take you two together. There's three.
Do you want to take the questions in?
Let's just take, anyone want to go now? We'll just take three quick questions, and then John will wrap up. From the back, just quick.
Okay, my questions are the global publishers. Is there like the publisher house are more centralized?
Yeah, it's a great question. Geography of publishing, great question.
Yes.
Good.
And as someone trying to get into the publishing industry, in front of all this turmoil, seeing the polarisation of the field is very interesting because I don't find it's reflected in opportunities available. So I understand that it's difficult to get into the smaller publishing houses because there isn't room for you, but in the larger publishing houses, they'll only be offering one internship and 600 people will be applying. I just want to know, getting your foot in the door.
Yeah, okay. Good question.
Yes,
yep,
good question.
Yep.
Last question, except for me.
Sorry.
No, go on, please.
In your presentation, you showed that the e-book growth had now reached 20% in some cases of revenue. I suspect that will have a disproportionate percentage of the actual publishing house's profits because an e-book doesn't have all the added
Yep. It's good. Yeah, good, great. Okay, I'm going to stop.
So my question is, how do you? This will undoubtedly mean publishing houses will come under intense shareholder pressure to throw all of their resources into the area that produces the most profits. How do you think that the publishing house will resist that and still be able to maintain a physical book manufacturing capability when the shareholder pressure will be against that?
Okay.
And the final question for me, John, we haven't touched copyright. It's too big an issue to talk about. But do you think that the controversy over copyright that pervades journal publishing now will reach books?
Yeah, okay.
You've got
great questions.
You've got
okay, how much
3
minutes?
minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. Right. Start at the back. Geography of publishing. Great question, and it's all changing. It's all changing. Okay, because you're absolutely right. The traditional publishing industry, especially trade publishing, is geographically very specific. It's New York and London, essentially. And there are others. There are outposts elsewhere. Then Boston is an important center in the U.S., and you see some publishing happening in other parts of the U.S. and so on. But it's so overwhelmingly New York-based. There's a physical proximity of the agents and the publishers. They're all together in the same small little world of Manhattan. That's really, really true. And London is very similar. And as this world begins to change, that's beginning to change too, because a lot of the startups, they're in California, they're in Chicago, they're all over the place because you don't need that physical proximity to the other centers, you know, that the traditional publishing houses depended on. And so that geography is beginning to change too, and you're absolutely right about that. It's a really, really interesting question. I know that personally because as I'm working on this, starting to work on this new research project, I've suddenly, you know, for the past 10 years, I've just been spending a lot of time in New York. But now, I've had to factor in the fact that I have to go to, you know, I have to go to Seattle quite a lot. I have to go to, you know, San Francisco quite a lot. I have to go to Chicago quite a bit. I have to travel all over the place. It's a very different thing because these organizations are all over the place. The geography is definitely changing. Your question about how to get in, well, it's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, there are still opportunities, and I really don't want to paint a kind of bleak picture, because I think the industry is going through really interesting times, and I don't think it's going away by any means. I think books will be with us forever. You know, I think this and just the way in which people are producing and reading and consuming them are going to change. You know, but the book business will be around, and so there are going to be opportunities. You've got to. You know, I think if you can get some training in another publishing house, even if it's an unpaid internship, that's a great way to go. There are lots of small to medium size. They're getting a little bit bigger. They're growing. And so there are opportunities there to get into a smaller house, even if the bigger houses are downscaling. So I think there are going to be opportunities, although it's not, I agree, it's not a particularly easy time. Your question, I mean, it's a great question, but I don't think the situation is clear, is your suggestion, because in principle what you say is right. That is that potentially it's that publishing, delivering content electronically is going to be more profitable, even if the revenues are not as high. So then you might think, well, that's going to, you know, shareholders are going to press for that. But the truth is, it's all too early. No one has really figured it out yet, and so everyone's just really kind of trying to figure out, are we actually more profitable? We don't even know if we're more profitable. You know, because top lines revenues are actually falling in some cases quite significantly. And therefore you still got all those staff and you've got all those overheads and your top line is falling. And are you saving enough by delivering 20% electronically to make up for the gap that's being created, the problem that's being created by the fact that your revenues are falling and you've got all those overheads? Well, probably not. So what you're doing in these large houses, you say, well, we can't actually continue to have all that office space. So let's rent out 3 floors of the Random House building in Manhattan, you know, to rent it out to someone else because we've got to start to cut our costs. So they're basically they're working at all these things, cutting costs, hoping that the revenue, that the profitability is going to be higher on the ebook sales, but never being entirely sure if it is, because after all, you remember, you're paying 25% royalties and not 10% royalties. You don't quite know how that's going to work out at the end of the day. So it's all too early to know the answer to that question. Even if it becomes clear that these publishing houses' revenues are declining, but they're greatly more flexible, you can be sure that Andrew Wiley will be the first to know, and he will say, no longer are you getting our books for 25%, I want 50%. And therefore, are you going to be more profitable then? Not so obvious. There's so many pressures on them. So then coming, David, to your point, briefly, well, yes, I mean, of course, the questions of copyright are absolutely fundamental in here. That raises so many questions about piracy, which I haven't touched upon. Fundamental question in this whole domain. The question about open access, which you were alluding to, but that's more to do with academic publishing. We were talking about that over dinner than it is to do with trade publishing, but it is an important consideration. So I think, you know, the whole issues around copyright and you know, who controls the copyright, what is it that a publisher has, you know, this is a big debate in the industry now. When you have certain players like, let's take an example, Open Road is one of the startup companies in New York, and basically what they say is, this book was published in 1950 as a book, as a printed book, and the publisher who published it, let's say it's Random House, they published the book, but they only had the right to publish the physical book. They didn't have the right to publish the ebook because it wasn't in the contract that they had the digital rights. And therefore, what Open Road has built a whole business on books published between 1920 and about 1995, because in 1995, publishers figured out that they'd better write it into the contract. They had books, they had the rights for the digital content as well as the physical content. But between 1925 and 1995, you got 70 years of books being published where there is nothing in the
Interesting.
contract about digital books, and they have built a whole business on going to that material and saying, let's do the ebook of this book that was published in 1935, but never published as an ebook. And then, of course, if the publisher, like Random House, says, you don't have the rights to do that, then, yes, I do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Who decides? No one knows. No one knows the answer. It's, you know, there are court cases, but they've not clearly determined an outcome. So the issues are very complex.
So listen, it's hard for me now to find ways of thanking John. I mean, just because you're all here and it's 10 to 10, it tells us quite a lot, you know. John, I mean, you've not only engaged us and illuminated the field of publishing, but you've told the incredible stories, and I think we can all go from here and we'll remember a lot of the stories you've told. It was it was an evening with John Thompson, so it was much more than a lecture. So thank you for the lovely evening, John. And yeah, that's